Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Zombies are boring. A Valarie, LeFevre, Ms. Adventure, Part 2. The keeper pushed aside one of his Z-Tech members to better see the subject stretched out on the lab table. The stench of the thing didn't seem to bother the zombies, but he had to wear a protective mask. It even burned his eyes, like a skunk, he thought. That's why they call it a skunk ape, I suppose. The zombie, whose name tape read Jared, fed an injection into an IV drip that was plugged into the creature's forearm. It moaned in fear, though it had been sedated, at least a little. It was hard to know the proper dose with such heavy and dense-muscled animals. The injection contained the same Z-Tech potion or compound that kept the zombies in either eternal bliss or eternal perdition, yet allowed their talents to remain intact. Dr. Z had obtained some from blood samples from the human zombies. Darwinius Narcisse had absolutely refused to give up the recipe. It was just as well. It had taken Dr. Z only a short time to separate the chemical from the blood samples, and then break down each to determine the source materials. A pair of the chemist Z-Techs did most of the detail work. A married couple, originally from the Ukraine. The keeper had been responsible for setting up a camera to record the thumping bass music and the gajuma dance that Narcissa performed to aid the process, with fairly standard hypnosis techniques. They would soon be able to dispense with the little witch doctor and make their own zombies. From the more interesting subjects whose dietary idiosyncrasies he so enjoyed, the creatures on the table faded into a fitful, twitching sleep. It would awaken within a few hours, and the rest of the experiment would proceed. Another V-Tech member slipped a VR helmet over the skunk ape's head. They could watch it unsupervised until it began to stir. Inform me when the buzzera as soon as it shows signs of returning consciousness. He placed a hand on a female whose nameplate read Dorothea Garcia, and repeated the instructions. He'd found it the best to be specific when instructing Z-Tech members. They weren't long on showing individual initiative. In the meantime, he conducted a round to check on his other charges. If the experiments went well, they would soon have controlled monsters to set loose and do their bidding. Unfortunately, one of the biggest specimens did not appear to be very aggressive on its own. It would take a serious dose to get the Bigfoot on her feet. She'd been pretty mournful from the start, like she'd lost her mate or best friend. Her distraction may have been why they'd caught her so easily. He'd arrived outside her paddock and was astonished. She'd always sat pretty well out in the open, but now she wasn't immediately visible. The interior was equipped with a miniature fake forest. It currently appeared to be impossibly empty. The portions of the trees were not big enough to hide her. Where the he gasped through clenched teeth. He quickly used the keypad to unlock the enclosure and rushed in to look closely. Unfortunately for him, he'd forgotten that healthy members of the species were very good at camouflage. Even as he turned to leave, a bulky figure arose silently in his wake. Then soft but inexorable bands enveloped his chest and pressed his back against an equally soft and unyielding surface. He felt his ribs creak, and each time he exhaled, the bands tightened with the blood rushing in his ears and a dark periphery closing in on his vision. He lost consciousness. His next memory was of a bright light piercing his eyes and a hand that slapped his face. "Get up, Einstein!" Dr. Z was in a foul mood. "You let the Zap Squatch escape. She ripped apart 3 of our Z-Squad guards and injured some of the Z-Techs on the way out of the facility and nearly scared poor Narcissa to death." Carlos sat up from the floor of the enclosure and tried shaking his head to clear it. This is not a good day for me, he thought, as the motion caused the ache in his head to increase and created vertigo and a spinning sensation that led to nausea. Dr. Z retrieved his supplies. "It doesn't look like you have any serious injuries. Your ribs will be sore for a few days and you will have a headache for the rest of the day. No less than you deserve. All the efforts of catching the beasts, especially a Sasquatch, when they are usually so clever. Now this one is loose and can find its way back to us. You best hope that the hunters find it. They're out tracking as we speak." Valarie heard a sound she hadn't heard since she'd left the country. The baying of hounds. "That takes me back," she mumbled to the mockingbird on the limb to her right. It squawked, mockingly, and flitted to another perch. The dogs had clearly discovered a trail, but they were a long way from her. The woods carried sounds as often as they muffled him. Still, it's back where old Tall Guy jacked up my peaceful morning journey. She picked up her pace and angled back towards the roadway. She'd been following her own back trail. There hadn't been a trail of huge footprints to follow in the deep pine straw beds of the patch of trees. Yet she'd had that special feeling that she was onto something. Now it led her forward. When she reached the roadway, she'd stowed the little rifle in the sheath that ran along the side of her backpack and checked her waist pack. It was a park road and sparsely traveled, but she decided to be cautious. Voices arose from the other side of the pavement, the side where the Sasquatch had fled, and the hounds had ceased their bellowing. She could not make out the words of the hunters, so she stalked closer. Off in the woods, close to where the bestiary had disappeared, she made out several figures in camouflage attire. One of them held a pair of hounds that were leashed and that strained towards the base of a long fallen tree. She crept forward until she could make out the words. "Yeah, something hurt it. I think the legs broke or at least hurt bad. The trank should help with that, too. Hurry up and get those bands on her. Sneaky bitch done got away once." He tapped one of the others on the shoulder. "Go get the transport. Bring it down to the road to where we came inside the trees. Hurry." The man he touched took off silently through the trees back towards the road, his features slack as he jogged along. He passed near Val's hiding spot, but never turned his eyes in any direction but forward. "Now there's a man with purpose," she thought. "I could have stood here in the open and he wouldn't have noticed. Speaking of that, I need to work around so that when the rest come this way, they won't trample me." A howl rose from the creature at the base of the tree. The sound contained uncounted sorrows and longings and pains. It was loud enough to attract the attention of other beings out in those woods, loud enough to wake the nocturnal ones. She wondered if it was crying for help, and if so, what might respond. Cletus, as she dubbed the lead hunter, clapped two of the others on the shoulder. "Gag her, and if she tries to bite you, punch her in the mouth." He glared at the supine figure stretched out on the ground before him. "I know what that was. If any of your kinfolk show you going to be in trouble. The rest of you unlimber your rifles. Anyone or anything we don't know coming in view, shoot it." The slack-jawed morons around him did as they were bid, a bit mechanically, as if they were slow on the uptake. Val had a feeling that it was more than just dull wits at work. The slack features bothered her, tickled at memories. She'd read about something like this. She considered options. She might be able to rescue the overlarge damsel in distress. She owed the old lady of the forest that much. There were 6 camotards left. It would take number 7 a while to get back to the point from which they'd started, unless they'd left a vehicle along their back trail. She didn't recall any other vehicles at the parking lot where her Jeep rested. They must have some camp or shack in the woods, but I hadn't found it, so maybe on this side. The decision was taken for her when one of the rifles cracked. One of the zombies, yes, that's what they reminded her of, had fired his rifle once and then simply stood still, staring into the trees. The closest one to him soon followed suit. Val couldn't see their target or targets, but hoped they were unhurt. "Guess she called her goon squad on you, Cletus," she gritted quietly. All the while she'd watched. She'd removed her pack and set it on the ground and prepared her own rifle. The fancy sights were set in daylight mode, and she zoomed her view out among the trees. Whatever the Slackjaws had seen, she did not. Cletus yelled at the others, "If you see 'em, shoot 'em! Then chamber a new round and shoot 'em some more! Dang, you zombos are dumb!" He scanned the woodline for threats and clearly saw nothing. Val was absorbed in the tableau before her and did not notice she had company until a tremulous shadow engulfed her, and a rustle of dry pine straw whispered a warning. The figure, an obvious male version of Lady Godiva, loomed from behind her. It held a good-sized rock and sent it flying, not towards the shooters or Cletus, but one of those who'd gagged the female of his kind and now sat staring stupidly into space. The man remained slack of features, even as his head exploded into wet, red remnants and pulp that rested on his shoulders, sank with the rest of his body into the hollow at the base of the fallen tree. Val had rolled onto her back and now aimed her little rifle up at the mighty torso above. The being regarded her, features indecipherable. She lowered the muzzle and moved it to one side. The small caliber may kill the thing several days from now, long after her remains had begun to deteriorate, should she press the trigger. She gave a closed-lipped, non-threatening smile and gestured a thumbs up. The creature stepped behind a large tree to their right as Cletus and company craned to see. Val froze to reduce the chance they'd detect her. Unfortunately, old Cletus had good eyes. "I see you out there. We got you covered." His voice lowered momentarily. "Cover her, dummies!" He spoke loudly again. "You might get one or two of us, but we got 5 rifles aimed at you." For a moment, Val hoped they were talking to the hulking figure that had totally disappeared from her view. Then her hopes were shattered. "Put down that little rifle and we'll just take you prisoner for murdering our friend. You done stepped off into something you shouldn't have." Val briefly considered fighting, but zombie morons or not, they had the drop on her. She didn't know whether the near beastman was an ally or involved with his own mission. A rifle cracked and detritus from the forest floor kicked up about a foot from her head. "I'm to hit a foot from your head. Guess where I'm aiming now." Val soon found herself mostly disarmed and seated beside her hirsute lady friend. Her big friend with the flying rocks had not come to the rescue. Cletus did not look rattled about her presence. He didn't even ask her any questions. She sat silently, working at her bonds, her zombie guard watching her wiggle her shoulders and flex her arms without any interest, much less concern on his features. She hoped that the male Sasquatch would make another rescue attempt, but he had not before the sound of an engine approached. It was on the road, not too far distant, and sounded like a diesel. Presently, while the big engine idled, another roared its way towards them. When it came into view, Val could see it was a small 4-wheeler with a long trailer. The navigator had apparently found some way past the verge, and the nimble little vehicle now ducked and dodged around the trees to within about 30 feet of the prisoners. The driver, the zombie who had been sent running to fetch him, sat silently at the wheel and swayed with the movement of the little vehicle when he brought it to a top, sat staring, a little drool spilling from one side of his mouth. "Hey, see," the driver called to Cletus. No way, Val thought. "Brought your boy back with me. They ain't much company, but they can drive the 4-wheeler. The hounds are better conversationalists, though." He paused. "Ooh la la, you got a bonus catch." He eyed Val lasciviously. She was used to creeps looking at her like that, undressing her with their eyes, but she was typically better armed these days and could discourage them. For the moment, she was nervous and let it show. The better To have you underestimate me when the time comes, my dears. She gave an internal wicked grin. Hey, Don. Yeah, she creeped up on us all quiet like. Took out one of my zombos. No loss. He'll make good feed for the critters. She might too after a while. In the meantime, we gotta get the big hairy princess onto your trailer and haul her back to her cage. The keeper's gonna be pissed at her. Don, the new arrival, shrugged. Let him. He won't do anything too bad until Dr. Z lets him. He looked at Val. Same with this one. Little dumbass made sure to get recorded at the parking lot. The cameras are ours, sweetie pie. Ha ha! With the work of the Z Squad, they soon had the Squatch loaded, and they bounced her back towards the roadway, careless of her injuries. Don insisted on carrying Val himself and working in a groper 3. Hey, Charlie, you mind getting her pack and pea shooter? Not Cletus after all, Val thought mournfully, while she imagined the agony she would inflict on Don at the first opportunity. She'd make it last, if at all possible. At the roadway, they transferred Lady Godiva from the trailer to the back end of a large panel truck. Don placed Val beside her, large, warm, hairy co-captive. The poor being wore an expression that Val could only read as abject misery mingled with pain. Once the doors closed, she spoke to her fellow prisoner. My name is Val. I came back for you. A lie, but perhaps she'd been fated. If I can get our bonds loose, could you run away with me? I see that your leg has already healed some. My sister, she's a dogman, woman. She heals that way. The heavy face just stared at her, tears welling, either more fear or frustration at her own inability to communicate. Val hung her head and nodded silently. She hoped that her silence would be accepted as a symbol of peaceful intentions. She felt the truck continue down the road for a distance. Then the driver conducted a 3-point turn to head back towards the bridge highway. He turned towards the narrow split that ran between the road and the river and plunged downward. She strained to listen for traffic from the more heavily traveled bridge highway, but the truck walls were insulated. No light leaked into the interior. There was a dim red ring of LED lights that ran around the ceiling and provided something like the lighting that zoos use to display nocturnal animals. The floor was a thick mat, not padded, but not as hard as bare metal or wood would be. The truck slowed and after a few more turns stopped. The door opened smoothly. No cliché, dramatic rattles and clanks, she thought sarcastically. They brought in an oversized gurney for Lady Godiva. You dress like her, my friend. I wish you well. Val smiled wanly. The large being stared back listlessly. Her head lolled to one side on the flat surface. Then she closed the eye that was closest to the surface. She winked at Val, who had suppressed a laugh of glee. She understood. Maybe. They hauled her out of the truck. No nonsensical chatter this time. Don helped her down from the truck since her hands were still bound behind her with heavy zip ties. He tried to cop another feel and ended up on the floor a moment later, clutching at his bruised groin. Val did nothing more than glare at Charlie. He grinned, trying to hide the expression from Don, and then shrugged. Gotta treat this one like a lady for now. He extended a hand to his friend, who lay on his side and coughed and struggled to regain his breath. When he was able to stand, he stared balefully into Val's eyes and drew back his fist. I'll show you what we do to bitches that get out of line. He grated through his teeth. He drove his fist towards Val's nose. She easily dodged the strike thanks to his melodramatic warning. She delivered a snap kick to his abdomen, and when he bent forward, she conducted a flawless spinning roundhouse kick to the side of his head. He fell to the floor, eyes rolling, mouth bleeding. Charlie could no longer hold back and guffawed. Ha ha! I told you sooner or later you was gonna get one that not only fights back but knows how. As Val had completed her maneuver, he seized her elbow and raised it to bend her forward in a control hold, aided by her bonds. She knew a counter, but let him think she was pliable for the moment. By the time Don managed to lift his head from the floor and awkwardly climb to his feet, his features were flushed with rage and spittle dripped from the edges of his mouth, along with blood and another trickle of scarlet fluid drained from one nostril. Before he could act, another voice interrupted. Dr. Z. "What do you boys have for us? I see that you brought back my prize. Your bank accounts will be duly swelled." He eyed Don. "Did she injure you? Do you need some attention?" Don looked sullenly at the floor. Charlie grinned and replied, "No problem, Doc. Just a little accident when we unloaded this one." He patted Val's shoulder. Dr. Z knew when to let things slide. He'd already guessed that Don had finally found a woman who could beat him. He examined Val and then took her chin and raised her face from the bent position in which Charlie held her. He glanced at Don. "For once you show good taste. Not that I think you would know the difference. You also show bad judgment. This one has skills. We need to replace the Z-Squad guards that our princess destroyed when she exited our facility. One of the injured Z-Techs will likely expire." He continued to stare at Val. "So, do you have a profession that would be helpful to a biomed operation? We know you would make an excellent addition to our security team." He didn't care about her response. He already had her in mind to test his manufactured zombie juice on her. She gave no answer but an empty stare. He shrugged. "Very well, we'll develop her for Z-Tech. If she is not a worthy addition, we can always use her as a guard or, at worst, monster chow." The keeper arrived and helped Charlie to escort Valarie from the garage space. They left Don and the Z-Squad hunters, zombies who had been poachers taken from illegal hunting operations over the last few seasons, to tend to the vehicles and conduct the cleanup process. Dr. Z peeled off to head back to his own pursuits, and the two men walked Val through several passages and down some stairways, definitely below the level of the river, she decided, and finally into a corridor lined with windows on either side. The corridor wound precipitously, but with purpose. None of the paddocks were visible to another, and they were heavily insulated. Her captors allowed her to swivel her head and peer into the cages. "Dogman," she thought, as she passed one. In another was a creature that was all at once tall and squat-looking, due to its massive shoulders. It had a heavy snout like a baboon. She had no idea what to call the thing. They passed a Sasquatch, not hers, several more dogmen, an enormous black cat, and then a werewolf. Her flesh crawled with an instinctive fear reaction. The escort slowed before they turned the next corner, where she was to be temporarily housed among the monsters. She forced herself to look at the werewolf. It could not see her through the one-way glass, nor smell nor hear her through the insulation, yet it peered back at her, and she recognized the eyes, and the hints of features left after the transition. It was Earl. So quoth this raven. Oh, my dears, what a sad turn of events. Poor Earl. We shall see if he gets out. I have another two-parter coming up that is in the Lacey timeline that I hope you enjoy. That'll be the next 2 weeks. Thank you so much, Bear, and have a lovely Thursday, everyone. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.